Welcome to CultureCast. My name is Adrienne Kubiak.
I'm Emily Finnegan.
I'm Precious Whitfield.
And I'm Elizabeth Perez.
And today we'd like to talk about Ariel Dorfman's play, Death in the Maiden. So, does anybody know about Ariel Dorfman?
Yes. Ariel Dorfman is a Chilean-American novelist, playwright, essayist, academic, and human rights activist. He was originally born in Buenos Aires. He was a professor at the University of Chile, and then he went to grad school at UC Berkeley. Dorfman has lived in the United States since 2004 and was a professor of literature and Latin American studies at Duke University. When he lived in Chile, Dorfman served as a cultural advisor to President Salvador Allende. Here's some background info on the play. Death in the Maiden explores a country that recently went through several human rights violations. It's safe to assume that this may be his home country of Chile, because various scenes that allude to it as such. The play follows Chile's change to democracy and mentions the Reddick Commission. In Chile, Augusto Pinochet was involved in a coup that overthrew Salvador Allende. He was a dictator of Chile between 1973 and 1990. Human rights violations that his regime committed included sexual abuse, waterboarding, and murder. 130,000 people were arrested during his rule.
Hang on, what's the Reddick Commission?
The Reddick Commission is a truth commission on human rights abuses resulting in death or disappearances that occurred under Pinochet's rule. The commission found that over 2,000 people had been killed for political reasons, and dozens of military personnel have been convicted of human rights abuses. 957 people disappeared after their arrest, and the results of the commission were that 641 times the commission could not determine that the people died from political reasons, and 449 cases, no information beyond the person's name could be determined. So what do you want to tell us about the play, Adrienne?
So, Death in the Maiden follows Paulina Salas and her husband Gerardo Escobar after the fall of a violent dictatorship in some unnamed South American country. On his way home one evening, Gerardo's car breaks down, so a stranger named Roberto Miranda kindly helps him by driving Gerardo home. When they reach the Salas-Escobar home, Paulina recognizes Roberto as a dark figure from her past. So this play only has 3 characters. We have Paulina Salas, the female protagonist, who is the wife of Gerardo, and she knows Roberto from her past. Gerardo Escobar, the husband of Paulina, was recently appointed to an investigation committee, so his job is to investigate, basically. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And finally, we have Dr. Roberto Miranda, who is the kindly stranger that helps Gerardo after his car breaks down. So, in the show, it starts out, Gerardo's car has broken down one night, so a kindly stranger, Roberto, stops and helps him. As a thank you, Gerardo invites Roberto to stay overnight. Once they get back to their house, Paulina recognizes Roberto's voice as a figure from her past. The next scene starts up, and we find Roberto tied to a chair by stockings and being held at gunpoint by Paulina. At this point, Paulina explains that this is the guy who tortured her in her past. She keeps saying that he's the doctor who played Schubert's Death in the Maiden, hence the title of the show. Paulina asks Gerardo to help put Roberto on trial for his crimes. She also forces Gerardo to acknowledge that she was raped. Gerardo is getting upset at Paulina at this point because she's jeopardizing his new position on the investigation committee. Paulina explains that Roberto can only be freed through confession. He has to confess that he was responsible for her torture in the past if he wants to survive, basically. So, Roberto and Gerardo team up unknown to Paulina to help Roberto confess. So, as part of this plot, Gerardo asks Paulina to tell him about the abduction and the imprisonment. So then he relays the information to Roberto, who then testifies. After the confession, Paulina actually does not set him free, though. Instead, she points a gun at Roberto and claims that his confession was the evidence that she needed to prove that it was him. Because during her testimony to Gerardo, she planted minor false details, such as changing a name, which Roberto corrected, thus proving that he was part of the whole plot and he knew what actually happened. So, at this point, a mirror comes down over the stage, forcing the audience to reflect, in the most literal sense. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Finally, months later, Paulina spots Roberto at a concert. It's unclear whether or not he's real or not, but we'll get into more of that later. So there's a lot of irony in this show. Precious, do you want to talk about that?
Roberto's confession is steeped in irony. He claims to be innocent of the crimes that Paulina accuses him of committing and demands she frees him. However, the only way she claims she will free him is ironically if he confesses to these crimes. Thus, Roberto has to admit his guilt in order to go free rather than in a traditional justice system where proving one's innocent is the way to secure freedom. Also, Gerardo attempts to appease Paulina by encouraging Roberto to confess regardless of Roberto's innocence or guilt. The irony here is that Gerardo has spent the entire dictatorship preaching the exact opposite, resisting the crazy person in power and fighting for individual freedom. That he is unable to openly oppose his wife and settles instead for indulging her and not insisting on Roberto's freedom is in direct contrast to the ideals he embodied while speaking out against previous administration. Throughout the play, there were also some clear-cut goals and obstacles. Some goals include Paulina trying to get Roberto to confess about him being the individual who has tortured and raped her years ago. Some obstacles that she has faced is her husband Gerardo trying to convince her that she should not kill Roberto. I've also noticed a lot of narrative techniques used throughout the play.
Yeah, there were a lot that I found. The biggest one being script, because, well, the whole thing's a play, so it's a script. There was also things such as backstory and flash forward and all this stuff. So the whole backstory is kind of the key element in the play because Paulina's story of Roberto's torment from the past is told in a backstory, and that is really the event that sets everything in motion. There's also a flash forward. The last scene is set 4 months after the rest of the show. We also have Deus Ex Machina, or as I like to call it, Gerardo Ex Machina, because Gerardo kind of came to Roberto's rescue and helped him devise this story to help set him free. We also have foreshadowing that happens right at the beginning, because one can immediately tell that Paulina is suspicious of Gerardo, because if you tie someone up, you can tell that something is not going to go too well, which goes into the ticking clock scenario. We also have plot twist. The biggest plot twist, in my opinion, was the scene where Paulina comes back to kill Roberto since she has confirmed that he is the doctor who tortured her. We also had Chekhov's gun, which is a technique that requires every element to be given a purpose. Gerardo's new position of authority on the investigation committee kind of set the tone for his role in the confession. And also, the stockings that Roberto was tied up with did not seem like a very significant prop in the first scene of the show, but once you find Roberto tied up, you can see that they were very important. And finally, we had some cultural allusions to Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile, and also Schubert's classical music, which also played as a symbol.
For Paulina, Schubert is a symbol of civilization, specifically the civilized and idealistic version of society that was shattered during her captivity. She says that there is no way of describing what it means to hear that wonderful music in the darkness, describing how it felt when the doctor played Schubert for her after torturing her for 3 days. She repeatedly tells Roberto that she wants to get her Schubert back. Symbolically, being able to listen to Schubert again represents a restoration for Paulina and her ability to enjoy the comforts of society. And although the play never specifically names Chile as its setting, it is clear that Chile was the inspiration for Death in the Maiden, in which this case, Paulina is a symbol for all the victims of Chile's past dictatorship. Although she is only one person, Dorfman implies that her story of abduction and torture is one of thousands. Paulina's decision to seek out justice for past crimes, although not necessarily dangerous to society as an isolated incident, represents a major threat to the young country. As a symbol of thousands of other victims of the dictatorship, the message Paulina is sending is clear. The new government must work hard to satisfy the needs of this particular group.
I agree with that. I think that every character represents a symbol, like Gerardo. As a newly appointed member of the investigating commission, he is the voice of the new democratic government. His position between Paulina and Roberto symbolizes the new president's challenge in pursuing justice for the victims of the dictatorship without ostracizing the perpetrators, who are in many cases still prominent members of society. Gerardo's energy and optimism for the future speaks to the hope of the new government. His frustration at being stuck in the middle of Paulina and Roberto speaks to the democracy's transitional struggles. Roberto, the third member of the trio, symbolizes all of the countries accused. Similar to Chile after the fall of Pinochet, the world of Death and the Maiden contains thousands of citizens who supported or participated in the injustices of the fallen dictatorship. Like Roberto, many of these guilty parties are upstanding and seemingly admirable contributors to society, making it difficult to identify them. Additionally, many of these alleged criminals also insist on their innocence. Although there are many victims like Paulina who would demand their deaths, the government is interested in stopping the cycle of violence and therefore will not be systematically eliminating these people in the name of justice. This is the main tension in Death and the Maiden: how and if the victims, like Paulina, can live peacefully with their attackers, like Roberto, even though their government no longer casts them in these roles.
A motif of this play is the trial. Dorfman uses the recurring motif of a trial to emphasize the corrupt nature of vigilante justice within the context of an imbalanced society. Her decision to kidnap Roberto and try him for his crimes is Paulina's way of making up for the lapses of the government and the society that supposedly exists to protect her rights. The trial motif serves to remind the audience that Paulina is expected to move on with her life without the option of legal retribution. Gerardo's investigating commission will not be trying any perpetrators of torture or violence. Instead, the president has instructed them to simply investigate abuses of justice. A true trial, therefore, seems entirely out of reach for both Paulina and Roberto. That Dorfman constantly refers to the practice throughout the play only underlines its absence. Another symbol is the tire. Driving home from his meeting with the president, Gerardo gets a flat tire and his car hits a nail in the road. This busted spare tire serves as a metaphor for the problems in Gerardo and Paulina's marriage. The relationship needs work, but each participant is convinced that the other must put in the effort to do so. Meanwhile, Paulina is still furious at Gerardo for his adultery 15 years before, and Gerardo feels that Paulina's fixation on the past is hindering their relationship.
There's also a lot of imagery in Death and the Maiden. For example, moonlight. Dorfman uses this as a recurring image throughout the play. It serves as a visual reminder of Paulina's past and Roberto's presumed role in it. It also highlights certain painful truths between Paulina and Roberto, whether that's Paulina's violence against Roberto, Roberto's violence against her, or Roberto's haunting presence in Paulina's life.
The tape recorder is another image that appears throughout the play. Paulina employs it to record and play both her testimony and Roberto's confession, an essential element in her trial, and it becomes a fourth character in the play, a silent, visible witness to record the characters' official testimonies. Meanwhile, Paulina's decision to record her own testimony represents her desire to permanently push her story out in the open, which Gerardo insists is the only way she'll be able to move on.
Another aspect of imagery is Roberto tied to the chair. Violence bubbles underneath the surface of every moment in Death and the Maiden, even though the characters themselves barely attack each other physically. The image of Roberto tied to the chair, which persists throughout most of the play, is a visual reminder of Paulina's kidnapping, as well as the abduction, torture, and violence committed against thousands of others who suffered during the previous regime. As Paulina begins to hint at the details of her torture, the image of Roberto tied to the chair becomes weighted with these greater implications.
Another image is Paulina in hiding. Paulina hides throughout scenes 1 and 2, both of which take place at night. At first, she is fearful when she sees an unfamiliar car pulling up to her house and stands behind the curtains. She only comes out once Gerardo appears and she knows that she is safe. Later, when Roberto returns to the Escobar's home, Paulina edges out of the terrace into which she will be able to hear the men but not be able to be seen by them. By keeping herself hidden, Paulina herself becomes a visual embodiment of her past. She cannot fully return to the life of light or optimism until she fully explores the pain she has been carrying around, which is like a shadow hanging over her.
The play's tone is abrasive, tense, and dark. A significant part of the play happens during the evening. Numerous scenes develop in exactness dimness. What's more, there is a typical haziness that penetrates the play also. Death in the Maiden is likewise exceedingly practical until its last scenes, when showing components of the mirror and Paulina and Gerardo sitting in the gathering of people include a layer of imagery that strengthens the group of onlookers in a more dynamic style of viewership. One of the big themes in Death in the Maiden is the topic of what justice involves. Paulina's excuse for her violent behavior is her strive for justice. Justice from the man that tortured and raped her years ago. She just wants the truth about the individual that has her flinchy and protective. Forgiveness is a major theme in Death in the Maiden. Not only is Paulina unable to forgive Roberto for the torture she believes he inflicted on her, she also has struggled for a decade and a half to forgive Gerardo for cheating on her while she was in captivity. At the end of the play, Paulina claims that she can't spare Roberto's life because she cannot forgive someone who doesn't feel true remorse. The last theme is cycle of violence. Paulina can only achieve inner peace when she believes that true justice in her rape has been carried out. For her, this means the death of Roberto, whom she believes to be one of her torturers. In the moments before Paulina is about to shoot him, Roberto begs for his life by appealing to her to stop the cycle of violence, implying that his death will only prompt his own children to seek justice on his behalf.
We also noticed some common themes between Death and the Maiden and other works and events. For example, Hamlet. In both stories, the protagonist wants someone to confess some dark crime from their past. And both Paulina and Hamlet go to great lengths to try and publicize the crime. Paulina wants to have tape recordings of the confession as proof that Roberto was the actor in her torture, and Hamlet hires actors to portray the king's murder of his father.
That's really interesting. Antigona Furiosa was another play that reminded me of Death and the Maiden. That's because of the historical context of it. La Madres de la Plaza de Mayo were women who could not be silenced after their sons were arrested and disappeared due to the corrupt government. This reminds me of the horrible injustices that happened during Pinochet's regime. Also, these officials did not really face the implications of their acts, similar to Pinochet, who died while facing over 300 charges of human rights violations, tax evasion, and even embezzlement. To conclude, we analyze this text to be a representation of Chile and the oppressive leadership from Augusto Pinochet that led to thousands of deaths and disappearances of Chileans. At the end scene, Paulina sees Roberto, which shows how her sufferings can never be erased. Although the Reddick Commission brought light to the human rights violations, they can never be undone.
Thanks for tuning in to CultureCast!